There is a small chapel on the summit of a mountain on the border between North Macedonia and Greece. It sits at 2,521 meters above sea level, above the tree line, above almost everything. Inside the chapel are skulls. The skulls of Serbian soldiers who died on that mountain in September 1916, stored there because nobody could identify them individually, because the fighting had been so close and so savage that what was left when it was over could not be separated into the names it had once belonged to. The mountain is called Kajmak Kalan. The chapel is called the Chapel of Saints Peter and Paul. The Serbs call the mountain the Gate of Freedom. The skulls have been there for over 100 years. I came across Kajmak Kalan while I was reading about the Macedonian front a few months ago, and it was one of those moments where I had to stop and go back, because what I was reading did not seem possible. A battle at 8,271 feet above sea level in September in the mountains, with bayonets, between men who had no cover on limestone rock and men who had been fortifying the position for a year, a regiment that went in 2,500 strong and came out with 950. A colonel who described the fighting to an eyewitness as the fiercest he had ever seen, with the bayonet and no quarter given. And the men doing this were the men who had survived the Albanian Golgatha, who had walked out of the accursed mountains the previous winter, half dead, and been evacuated to Corfu, and spent 9 months being rebuilt into something that could fight again. This is the story of Kajmak Kalan. It is the story of men who came back. I should tell you that this video connects to the broader story of the Serbian front that I have been building on this channel, and if you have watched the previous Serbian video, you will know the context. If you haven't, I'll give you what you need here, because the men on Kajmak Kalan cannot be understood without understanding where they had been. Before I give you the mountain, I need to give you what came before it, because without the Albanian Golgatha, the Battle of Kajmak Kalan is just a very costly engagement at high altitude, and with it, the battle is something else entirely. It is the culmination of one of the most extraordinary military and human journeys in the history of the First World War. In November 1915, the Serbian army was trapped. Germany and Austria-Hungary had attacked from the north under Field Marshal Mackensen. Bulgaria, which had fought Serbia in the Second Balkan War just 2 years before, had declared war and attacked from the east on October 14th. The combined force was over 600,000 soldiers. The exhausted, typhus-depleted Serbian army had roughly 250,000 men. France and Britain had landed at Salonica in Greece but could not advance north in time. There was no way out of Serbia except through the mountains of Albania in winter to the Adriatic coast, where Allied ships might come. Approximately 220,000 soldiers and 200,000 civilians made the journey. The mountains they crossed are called the Prokletajje in Serbian, the Accursed Mountains. They earned the name. The passes rise above 6,000 feet. The paths through them are barely tracks. The temperature in winter drops well below freezing. There was 1 week's rations when the retreat began. There was no adequate cold weather equipment. Austrian aircraft dropped bombs on the retreating columns, one of the first aerial bombardments of civilians in the history of warfare. Albanian irregular fighters attacked the flanks for what could be taken. Men who fell sat down and did not get up. Of the 400,000 people who started the retreat, approximately 120,000 soldiers and 60,000 civilians reached the Adriatic coast. The rest died in the mountains, or were captured, or were simply never accounted for. Among those who made the journey were 43,000 boys between 14 and 17 years old, taken along so the enemy could not conscript or kill them, so they could become the next generation of the army. 36,000 of them died in the mountains. 7,192 reached safety. The French Navy sent 87 liners and hospital ships escorted by 70 warships to take the survivors off. The men who arrived at the island of Corfu were so physically destroyed that thousands more died in the weeks after rescue. The sick were treated on the small island of Vido to prevent epidemic spread. So many died there that bodies were committed directly to the sea. That stretch of water is still called the Blue Graveyard. The Serbian army was reconstituted at Corfu and at Bizerte in North Africa over 9 months, re-equipped with Allied weapons, fed, rested, rebuilt into something that could function as a military force, then transferred to the Macedonian front, the Salonica front, a stretch of mountainous terrain running east to west through what is now North Macedonia, where Allied forces had been holding a static line against Bulgarian and German defenders since 1915. The men who arrived on the Macedonian front in the spring of 1916 were men who had fought for 2 years against Austria-Hungary, survived the Albanian winter, been pulled half dead from the sea and been given weapons and orders and pointed north. They had also, in the 9 months of rebuilding at Corfu and Bizerte, had time to think, time that men in continuous combat do not usually have. Time to process what had happened, the retreat, the mountains, the dead they had left behind, the families they did not know the condition of. Some of them had received no news from home since October 1915. They did not know if their villages were intact or burned, if their parents were alive, if their children had been deported. They knew only that Bulgarian administration was not gentle and that the Bulgarians they had fought in the Second Balkan War had not been gentle then either. What 9 months of that uncertainty does to a man is not something that can be easily described. It produces, in the accounts of the men who went through it and wrote about it afterward, a specific quality that is not quite grief and not quite anger, but sits between them, a kind of contained ferocity that the Corfu period had not eliminated, but had, perhaps, organised into something purposeful. The men who began climbing Kajmakyalan on September 12, 1916 were carrying all of that with them up the limestone slopes, not in any theatrical sense, simply in the ordinary, specific human sense of men who know exactly what they are doing and why, and who have had 9 months to think about both. Pointed in fact at the ground they had been driven from, the Macedonian front ran along the edge of territory that had been Serbian or Serbian-controlled before the war. To advance on that front was to advance toward home, and rising above the front line, visible from the positions around Lake Ostrovo, was a mountain, the highest peak in the Nidza range, 2,521 meters. Its name, in Turkish, meant cream skimmer, from a legend about a bandit chief who buried gold on the summit, killed his own men to keep the secret, and became its eternal guardian. In Serbian military memory, it would become the Gate of Freedom, the way back. The mountain was called Kajmakyalan. The Bulgarians had been fortifying it since 1915. The First Army's Bulgarian 1st Infantry Brigade, with the 11th Sliven Regiment making the main effort, had spent a year turning it into a mountain fortress. 2 successive lines of trenches cut into the limestone rock, wire obstacles across the approaches, machine gun positions built into natural features of the karstic terrain, the jagged, pitted limestone that offers almost no cover to anyone moving across it, but excellent firing positions to anyone behind it. Artillery pieces that had been hauled to these altitudes at, as one British observer would write, the expense of almost superhuman labour. Their guns were positioned on the reverse slopes of the mountain in ravines that he described as almost impenetrable. From those positions they could fire on the approaches to the summit while remaining invisible to the attackers below. The mountain was also, strategically, the key to everything. Kajmakyalan dominated the entire region, the valley of the Kurna River, the approaches to Monastir, the supply lines running north and south along the Macedonian front. Whoever held at Kajmakyalan could observe every movement for miles in every direction. A Bulgarian artillery observer on the summit could call fire on any movement in the valley below. The Serbian army could not advance toward Monastir while those eyes were on the heights. The German and Bulgarian commanders understood this and had been fortifying the mountain for a year before the Serbian attack. The Serbian commander understood this and understood that the mountain could not be bypassed. It had to be taken at whatever cost, because the alternative was to leave an observation platform overlooking everything the Serbian First Army did for the rest of the war. What made the strategic problem acute in September 1916 was that the broader Monastir offensive required forward movement across the full width of the front. The mountain could not simply be contained or screened. Adjacent French and Russian forces were advancing in their sectors. If the Serbian sector did not advance, the flanks of the forces that were advancing would be exposed. Kajmakyalan had to fall for the offensive to have coherent shape. The Drina division was going up the mountain regardless of what it found there. The Serbian First Army under General Zivojin Misic was assigned to take it. I want to give you Misic properly because he is one of the specific human beings in this story that I find most compelling, and his life before Kajmakyalan shaped what happened on Kajmakyalan in ways that matter. Zivojin Misic was born on July 19, 1855 in the village of Struganik near Mionica in western Serbia. He was the youngest of 13 children of a peasant family. His parents had 13 children, of which only 8 were alive when he was born. When he was 6 years old, he was a shepherd on the hills above his village. He finished primary school in Kragujevac, where he was bullied by city children for his peasant origins, and went on to the military academy, and spent 40 years in the Serbian army fighting in every war his country fought from 1876 onward. He fought in the Serbo-Turkish Wars. He fought in the Balkan Wars. He was forced into retirement by political intrigue and came back when the war with Austria-Hungary began. He commanded the Serbian First Army at the Battle of Kolubara in December 1914, when King Peter I walked to the front with a rifle and the Serbian counterattack turned the Austrian occupation of Belgrade into a rout. He was an opponent of the Albanian Golgatha. He believed the army should stand and fight, rather than retreat through the mountains. He was overruled. He made the retreat anyway, walking out of the mountains with the army he had wanted to keep in the field, and then he spent 9 months at Corfu rebuilding it. By the time the Serbian First Army arrived on the Macedonian front in the spring of 1916, Misic was 60 years old and had been at war almost continuously since 1912. He was the most decorated Serbian military officer in history. He was given the assignment of taking a mountain that looked impossible to take. There is a specific quality of General Misic as a commander that I think explains something about why the Drina division did not break on Kajmakchalan when the Bulgarian counterattacks of September 25th to 26th cost them 1,500 men in a single night. Misic had a relationship with his soldiers that was different from the relationship that most senior commanders of the First World War maintained with their men. He had been a peasant shepherd at 6 years old. He had been bullied as a provincial boy in the city. He had taught at the military academy, written professional lectures during his forced retirement, been recalled to service because the country needed him. He understood, in a way that officers from aristocratic or professional class backgrounds sometimes did not, the specific quality of what his soldiers were. Most of the men in the Drina division were peasants from Western Serbia, farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, men whose families had been sending them to fight in Serbian wars since the 1870s, men who had already survived the Albanian Golgotha and 9 months of rebuilding at Corfu, men who were fighting, in the most literal possible sense, to go home. Misic's insistence during the Battle of Kolubara in December 1914, when every other Serbian commander was arguing for continued retreat, had been that the men would fight if they were given a chance to fight. He had been right. The specific trust between him and the soldiers under his command, not the mechanical trust of formal hierarchy, but the earned trust of a man who knew what they were and believed in what they could do, was a resource that the mountain consumed over 18 days without exhausting. Before the attack began, there was a diplomatic context that shaped why it was launched when it was launched. Romania had entered the war on the Allied side in August 1916, partly because the Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front had seemed to show that the tide was turning against the Central Powers, and partly because the Allies had offered Romania the specific territorial gains, Transylvania and other Austro-Hungarian territory, that the Romanian government had been waiting for. Romania's entry required, as one of its conditions, an Allied offensive on the Salonica front to pin Bulgarian forces and prevent them from being transferred north against Romania. The Monastir offensive was that offensive. Kajmakchalan was fought, in part because Romania needed it to happen. This context does not diminish what the Serbs did on the mountain. It adds a layer of bitter irony, because Romania's military performance in the autumn of 1916 was disastrous. German and Bulgarian forces invaded from 2 directions and conquered 2/3 of the country within months. The offensive condition that Romania had required was met. The Serbian soldiers who died on Kajmakchalan in September 1916 died partly in fulfillment of a diplomatic promise to an ally who collapsed before winter. The specific weight of that irony belongs to the men on the mountain, who had no way of knowing it as they climbed. The Monastir offensive opened on September 12, 1916 with a 2-day artillery barrage. The wider Allied attack involved French, Serbian, Russian, Italian and British forces across the full width of the Macedonian front, approximately 360,000 Allied troops against an estimated 280,000 to 300,000 Central Powers defenders. The specific Serbian task was Kajmakchalan. The Drina division and elements of the Danube division were assigned as the main assault force. The Drina division was named after the Drina River, the river that had formed the western border of Serbia, the river that the Austro-Hungarian armies had crossed 3 times in 1914 and been thrown back from 3 times. The division had been formed from recruits drawn primarily from the regions around that river, from the western villages of Serbia closest to the Austrian border. These were men who had grown up knowing that the Drina was where the enemy came from, who had fathers and grandfathers who had fought the Turks and the Bulgarians and the Austrians in the previous decades of Serbian military history, the specific regional character of Serbian army divisions, each division drawing from a particular area its men from the same communities, often related to each other, knowing the same villages and the same geography, gave them a cohesion that conscript armies assembled from random national pools sometimes lacked. The men of the Drina division had a collective identity rooted in a specific place. That place was now occupied. They were fighting toward it. I want to be specific about one detail of the battle that most accounts pass over, which is the cold. September at 2,521 meters is not September at sea level. The temperature at the summit of Kajmakalan in the final week of September 1916 was dropping significantly below what the men on the slopes were experiencing at the bottom. Stebbing, writing from Ostrovo at the base of the mountain, noted the stormy cold days as uncomfortable. At 8,000 feet, the wind chill was substantially worse. The men fighting in the upper trench lines in the open limestone positions near the summit were fighting in conditions that combined the physical demands of high-altitude combat, reduced oxygen, increased fatigue, the difficulty of running or climbing quickly, with temperatures that made wet clothing a hazard and rest in exposed positions genuinely dangerous. The mountain in late September was already showing the character of early winter. The night of the 25th to 26th, when the fighting was at its most intense, was a night in which the temperature on the upper slopes was well below what men in summer weight uniforms could maintain body heat through. The wounded who could not be immediately evacuated, and the steep, narrow routes off the mountain meant evacuation was never immediate, were at risk from exposure as well as from their wounds. I want to describe the terrain these men had to cross because it matters more than almost any other single factor in understanding what the battle cost. The limestone karst of the Nidza range is not like the clay and chalk of the Western Front. It is jagged, fractured rock with almost no topsoil, which means almost no cover. A man moving across the lower slopes of Kajmakalan in September 1916 was moving across open rock, exposed from above, with the Bulgarian positions on the heights able to observe and fire on everything below them. The wire obstacles and trench lines had been cut into the rock itself, not dug in soft earth but blasted and chiseled into material that took enormous effort to break and provided no purchase for entrenching tools. The routes up the mountain were few and narrow, which meant that attacking forces were channeled into predictable approaches that the defenders had pre-registered with their artillery. The Bulgarian defenders had the specific advantage that all mountain defenders have: height. In mountain warfare, height is firepower. A machine gun position above an attacking force has a field of fire that a flat ground position never achieves. The Bulgarian machine gun nests on the slopes and crest of Kajmakalan could cover the approaches with overlapping fields of fire that left almost no ground in shadow. The Serbian infantry advancing up those slopes had no equivalent advantage. They had artillery support from French batteries in the adjacent sector. Their own guns could not be brought to bear effectively at those angles, but the limitations of artillery at altitude, in terrain that limited observation, meant that the guns could not do the work that the infantry was going to have to do themselves. There was a Swiss criminologist named Rudolf Reis who had come to Serbia in 1914 at the request of the Serbian government to investigate crimes against civilians in the early months of the war. He stayed. He reported from the front throughout the war. His accounts of the Serbian army in the field have a specific quality of detachment, a forensic observer watching soldiers rather than a soldier or a patriot, that makes them valuable. He was on the Macedonian front in 1916, and his observations of the Serbian units preparing for the Monastir offensive describe men who had been through the Albanian Golgatha and who carried that experience in their bearing in a way that he found difficult to articulate precisely. He writes about a quality of seriousness in the men, not grimness, not despair, but a kind of settled determination that he had not seen in the same degree in other armies he had observed. He attributes it to what they had survived and to what they were fighting toward. He was watching men who knew what they had lost and were going back to get it. That quality, whatever its precise name is, was what went up the slopes of Kajmakalan in September 1916. The attack began on September 12th and immediately demonstrated how costly the mountain was going to be. Edward Percy Stebbing was a British forester who had come to the Macedonian front as a transportation officer for the Scottish Women's Hospital Volunteer Ambulance Unit supporting the Serbian army. He was encamped at Ostrovo, directly below Kazmakalan, within sight and sound of the mountain throughout the battle. He kept a daily diary. He became friends with several Serbian officers passing through the hospital area. His account, published after the war, is the most detailed English-language eyewitness record of the Battle of Kazmakalan that exists. He describes his first clear view of the mountain on the morning of September 18th, 1916. Something took me into Ostrovo on a brilliant morning. We had beautiful autumn weather for the most part during the next month. The slopes of the great mountain lay bathed in sunlight with fleecy cloud masses here and there, in part composed of smoke from the batteries. The bursting shrapnel from the Bulgarian guns could be distinctly seen, as also our batteries firing up over the ridge searching for the Bulgar batteries on the far side, hidden in almost impenetrable ravines. The Kazmakchalan mountain mass rises sheer up due north of Ostrovo at a distance of about a couple of miles. It looks an impossible place to get troops and guns up into. It looked impossible. The Serbs went up anyway. The first line of trenches was breached on the night of September 17th to 18th after a concentrated bombardment. This was the beginning, not the end. The mountain had 3 successive lines of fortified trenches from the lower slopes to the summit. Breaking the first line meant beginning the approach to the second, exposed on the cleared ground above, with the Bulgarian defenders now firing from positions above and to both sides simultaneously. On the night of September 20th, the Serbs attacked the second line. Stebbing's diary. I was told that the Serbians were attacking the first of the 3 lines of trenches protected by wire entanglements. For 3 hours the turmoil continued. The Serbians were enfiladed by machine gun fire and lost heavily. He was writing about men being caught in crossing fire from multiple machine gun positions as they advanced across the open slope. The specific horror of being enfiladed, caught from the side rather than from the front, is that there is no shelter in the direction of advance. A man cannot go forward out of the fire because the fire is coming from the side. He can only go forward anyway or go back. The Serbs went forward. September 21st was a stormy, wet, thundery day. Kazmakchalan disappeared into dense cloud. Stebbing wrote, "It must be bitter cold work for both sides carrying out modern war at that elevation under such conditions. The fighting stopped, not because either side had decided to stop, but because visibility was zero and artillery was useless in cloud." The check, as he noted on September 22nd when the weather cleared, had enabled the Bulgarians to strengthen their positions. Every pause in the fighting was a pause that benefited the defenders, who could repair wire, resupply ammunition, reinforce the positions they were losing. The attackers could do nothing in the cloud except freeze and wait. September 23rd. Guns all day, the hottest engagement yet that night. September 24th. Heavy fighting in the afternoon, progress slower than anticipated. I want to pause on this phrase, progress slower than anticipated, because I think it obscures what those words mean at that scale and in those conditions. Progress slower than anticipated means that men died in numbers that could not be accounted for by the amount of ground gained. It means that the arithmetic of attacking a fortified mountain position was not working out the way the planning had suggested it would. It means that regiment commanders were looking at their casualty returns and their maps simultaneously, and trying to work out how to continue an operation whose cost was already exceeding what anyone had publicly anticipated before it started. The pattern of these days has the specific quality of the worst attritional fighting of the war, the small gains and the counter losses, the expenditure of men for yards of ground, the knowledge that above the current position there are more positions equally strong, and above those there are more still, and the summit is still far above everything. Then September the 25th to 27th, the nights that the Serbs and Bulgarians remember most. On the night of September 25th to 26th, the fighting reached a pitch that exceeded everything that had come before. The Bulgarians launched a series of counterattacks. They came at the Serbian positions 4 times. Each time they entered the Serbian trenches. Each time they were thrown out. The fighting was at close quarters, bayonets, grenades, anything, in the narrow trench systems cut into the limestone rock, in the dark, in the cold, at over 8,000 feet. Stebbing's diary for September 27th. when the news came through. The heavy firing on the night of the 25th to the 26th was the fiercest engagement which has yet taken place. It was hand-to-hand, the Bulgarians counter-attacking the Serbians to recover lost trenches on the heights. The enemy came on 4 times and got into the Serbian trenches only to be thrown out. Then, the figure. The Serbians had 500 killed and 1,000 wounded in that single night's fighting, on the slopes of one mountain. Stebbing's friend, Colonel Stojcic, one of the infantry regiment commanders, came through the hospital that day with a wound to his arm. He spoke to Stebbing directly. He said that the fighting had been of the fiercest with the bayonet and no quarter given. He said that his regiment had gone into the battle 2,500 men strong and now numbered 950. He said he had 30 officers killed and 30 more wounded. He had been one of the wounded himself in a forward trench when the bullet hit him. No quarter given. From one of the men who was there, who had led one of those regiments, who had the arm wound to show for it. No quarter given, at 8,000 feet, in the dark, in September. Between men who had been driven out of their country and men who had been set to hold the mountain that overlooked the road back to it. By September 23rd, the Serbian casualties had already reached approximately 10,000 killed and wounded, and that was before the night of the 25th and 26th that cost another 1,500. The Bulgarian companies had been reduced to 90 men each from their starting strength. One Bulgarian regiment had 73 officers and 3,000 men rendered hors de combat. Both armies were bleeding themselves on the same mountain at roughly the same rate. The difference was that one army was defending a position it had held for a year, and the other was attacking uphill into overlapping fire. The orders came on September 28th to give the Serbs 2 days rest before the final assault. The regiment that Stojcic had led in was rebuilding from 950 men. The other formations were doing the same, counting their dead, distributing the ammunition that had finally arrived after the supply problem, preparing for what everyone understood would be the decisive moment. September 29th. Stebbing went to watch. He describes the evening. Already the shades of night had fallen on the lower parts of the mountain, but the summit was bathed in soft yellow light from the rapidly setting sun. Soon this turned to blood red, a fitting pall for the night of carnage which was so soon to take place up there on the heights. He sat and watched the mountain through the night, watched the gun flashes and the star shells and the reflected light from the fighting he could not see. At some point during the night, the telephone spoke. There was nothing definite. The sound continued until morning, possibly muffled by the wind direction. No news came that could be given out. Then, September 30th. Through the day, the guns continued. Through the camp, as Stebbing moved about the work, he and everyone else waited. In the evening, just before supper, the telephone rang. The message came through. The Serbs had captured the crest and the Bulgarians were in full retreat down the steep northern slopes. The specific account of the final assault that survives in the Serbian sources describes the 3rd Battalion of a volunteer squad, led by Lieutenant Milivoje Dinic, going forward in a charge. The formal close combat with the Bulgarians in the pits lasted close to 1 hour, and then Kajmakalan, the proud mountain, was in Serbian hands, Stebbing that night. We were all, Serbians and British alike, very jubilant that night, and there was great festivity in the Serbian camp and our hearty congratulations were not wanting. The Serbians had still much hard fighting in front of them where Monastir was to fall, and that fall was to be directly attributable to their magnificent efforts and extraordinary pluck. But they never fought a better fight than when the 3rd Royal Serbian Army captured the crest of Kajmakalan after an Homeric contest and once again set foot on the beloved soil of their native land. The men who took Kajmakalan on September 30th, 1916 were the men who had walked out of the accursed mountains 11 months before. The men who had sold their rifles for bread in the passes. The men whose comrades lay frozen in the trails of winter 1915. The men who had been lifted off the Albanian shore by French warships and taken to Corfu and fed back to something that could stand upright. They were on Serbian ground for the first time since the Albanian Golgatha. The gate had been opened. Now I want to give you Flora Sanders here because she was wounded at Kajmakalan, and her specific experience of the battle is one of the documents of it that English-speaking readers can actually access. Flora Sanders was a Yorkshire rector's daughter who had arrived in Serbia in August 1914 with a St. John ambulance unit and who had, in the course of the 1915 retreat and its aftermath, formally enlisted in the Serbian 2nd Infantry Regiment as a private. She was the only British woman to serve as a combat soldier in the First World War. During the fighting around Kajmakalan and the broader Monastir offensive, she was caught in close quarters combat and seriously wounded by a grenade. The specific clinical record of her injuries: 28 shrapnel wounds from her knee to her shoulder on the right side of her body, her right arm shattered. She was unconscious and bleeding when a lieutenant crawled out under fire to drag her back. She was awarded the Order of the Karađorđe's Star, Serbia's highest military decoration, while recovering from those wounds, presented to her in hospital by the adjutant of Prince Alexander. She returned to the front in 1917. There is also Antonia Javornik, who received the same Karađorđe Star with swords after the Serbian victory at Kajmakalan and the entry into Bitola. She was wounded in combat during the breakthrough, and by the end of the war was a sergeant with 12 decorations. She is less known than Flora Sanders because she was Serbian, and Serbian women soldiers in this war have received even less attention in English than Serbian men. The Bulgarian perspective on Kajmakalan deserves its own moment, because the battle was as costly for the defenders as it was for the attackers, and the Bulgarian soldiers who held the mountain for 18 days against repeated assault were themselves doing something that requires acknowledgement. The Bulgarians on Kajmakalan were not inexperienced troops thrown into a position they could not hold. They were the 1st Infantry Brigade of the 3rd Balkan Infantry Division, with the 11th Sliven Regiment as the main element, a formation that had been fortifying this specific mountain for a year, and that knew its terrain the way that comes from living in a place through every kind of weather. Their commander, General Kliment Boyadjiev, was commanding a First Army that was simultaneously under pressure across the full width of the Macedonian front. The Kajmakalan position was critical to holding the entire Bulgarian line in this sector. Losing it would expose the flanks of every connected position. The Bulgarian counterattacks of September 25th to 26th, when they took back Serbian-held trenches 4 times and were thrown out 4 times, represent some of the most intense small unit fighting of the Macedonian front. These were not men throwing themselves forward in human waves. They were soldiers retaking specific trench positions in the dark, in conditions of close quarters fighting where the artillery of both sides was useless because the lines were too intermingled to fire without hitting friendly positions. The Bulgarian company strengths reduced to 90 men are the measure of what that fighting cost them. One regiment lost 73 officers and 3,000 men. They held for 18 days at that cost before the final Serbian assault on September 30th drove them off the summit and down the northern slopes. The German and Bulgarian High Command, in their assessment of the loss, described the fall of Kajmakalan and the 7 artillery guns taken there as irreversible due to the lack of a capable artillery reserve. This is the specific language of commanders who understand that they have lost something they cannot get back. They were right. The loss of Kajmakalan opened the Serbian path toward Monastir. On November 19th, 1916, 7 weeks after the summit fell, Serbian and French forces entered Monastir, the first significant Serbian city to be liberated since the 1915 collapse. Serbian soldiers walked into a Serbian city for the first time in over a year. I want to describe what that moment might have felt like, because the conventional military history of the Macedonian front tends to describe it in terms of strategic objectives achieved and kilometers of ground gained, and those terms lose the specific human weight of what it meant for the men who walked into Monastir on November 19th, 1916. These were men who had last seen Serbian cities in the autumn of 1915, when the 3-sided invasion overwhelmed the defences and the decision was made to retreat through Albania. They had walked out of their country, they had left their homes and in many cases their families behind them, in a country now occupied by a Bulgarian military administration that had immediately begun the systematic suppression of Serbian identity, language, schools and religious institutions. The Bulgarian occupation of Serbia had been conducted with a thoroughness designed to erase Serbian national presence from the occupied territory. Serbian schools closed, Serbian place names changed, the Serbian Orthodox Church suppressed, Serbian teachers and priests imprisoned or expelled. The men who walked into Monastir in November 1916 had spent a year being told, in letters that managed to get through and in the accounts of refugees who had escaped, what was being done to the country they had left behind. There is a specific account from one of the Serbian soldiers who entered Monastir that has been preserved in the Serbian military archive. He writes that when the column entered the city, an old woman came out of a doorway and stood on the pavement watching them pass. She was not cheering, she was not waving, she was simply standing there watching Serbian soldiers walking through a Serbian street, with an expression on her face that he says he could not describe. He writes, "I understood then what a year means. I had not understood before. The men who entered Monastir in November 1916 knew that their families were still in occupied Serbia. They knew what Bulgarian occupation meant. And they were walking into a city wearing Serbian uniforms for the first time since that retreat. The Macedonian front after Kajmakchalan and Monastir settled back into the specific stalemate that the terrain and the military balance imposed. The line stabilised a few kilometres north of Monastir, where the Bulgarian artillery dominated from the heights above the town. That line held until September 1918. Before I get to the end of this story, I want to give you the specific quality of what the Macedonian front was like for the men who served on it through 1917 and into 1918, because the Battle of Kajmakchalan tends to be presented as a moment of heroic action in an otherwise static theatre, and I think that understates what the men on that front endured in the years between the capture of the mountain and the final breakthrough. The Salonica front had been called the birdcage since 1915. The Allied forces were surrounded by neutral Greek territory and could not easily advance or withdraw, hence the name. The soldiers who served there called themselves, with the specific irony that frontline soldiers develop, the gardeners of Salonica. Allied newspapers used the phrase dismissively, implying that the forces at Salonica were tending their gardens while the real war happened in France. Winston Churchill called the campaign a strategic error. Lloyd George wanted to abandon it entirely. What the gardeners of Salonica were actually doing was holding a front of several hundred kilometres against Bulgarian and German forces, with roughly equal numbers on the other side, in conditions that were in some specific ways worse than the Western Front, and in other ways different in character. The heat in the Macedonian summer reached extreme temperatures that no Western Front soldier experienced. Malaria was endemic. The British forces at Salonica suffered 4 times more casualties from disease than from enemy action, and the malaria problem was so severe that anti-malarial drugs were issued as a standard supply item. The terrain made movement of supplies difficult and the front line miserable. The winter cold, particularly on the heights, was comparable to what the men had experienced during the Albanian Golgatha. But the men on the Salonica front were also holding something that no amount of dismissal from London or Paris could make less real. They were tying down approximately 600,000 Central Power soldiers. Those 600,000 men were not on the Western Front. They were not reinforcing the German lines in France. They were not available for the spring offensive of March 1918, when the German army drove within 40 miles of Paris and the war's outcome hung in genuine uncertainty. The birdcage was doing work that the gardeners of Salonica never received credit for, and the specific weight of that work was carried by men who were dying of malaria in the summer heat and frostbite on the mountain heights, in a theatre that their own side had publicly decided was not important. The breakthrough at Dobro Pole on September 15, 1918, when Serbian and French forces shattered the Bulgarian line in 4 days, and Bulgaria capitulated on September 29th, was the battle that ended the war on the Macedonian front and triggered the collapse of the Central Powers. Misic himself commanded the Serbian army during that final breakthrough. The same man who had led the assault on Kajmakchalan was there at the end, 2 years later, when the gate of freedom finally opened all the way. Before I give you the chapel and the skulls, I want to tell you about the end of Misic's war, because it is one of the specific moments of the Serbian story that I find most moving and that most people have never heard of. When the war ended in November 1918 and the Serbian army returned to its country, Misic was appointed chief of the Supreme Command WW1, the highest military position in Serbia. He oversaw the transition from wartime to peacetime. He was present at the formal ceremonies of liberation, the parades through Belgrade and the other Serbian cities. He saw, at 63 years old, the country that he had spent 40 years in the service of put back together into something that could call itself free. He died less than 3 years later, on January 20th, 1921, aged 65, a year and a half after the war ended. He had been in some form of military service since 1876, 42 years of Serbia's wars. He was buried at Topola, and his monument is in Belgrade. He is the most decorated Serbian military officer in history, and he is almost entirely unknown outside the Balkans. the man who won the Battle of Kolubara in 1914, who walked out of the accursed mountains with his army in 1915, who commanded the assault on Kajmakchalan in 1916, and who led the final breakthrough in 1918, the man who was arguably the most effective military commander Serbia ever produced, has no significant presence in the English-language histories of the First World War. I want to give you one more specific image before I close, because I think it is the one that stays with you longest after everything else has been absorbed. When the battle was over, and the Bulgarian dead had been recovered and the Serbian dead had been collected from the slopes of the mountain and the summit, the men on Kajmakchalan began building something. There were too many dead to identify. The karstic limestone had done to the bodies what limestone does. The specific violence of rocky ground is different from the specific violence of soft ground, and the men who gathered the dead on Kajmakchalan found remains that could not be put back into individual names. So they built a chapel on the summit, formally completed in 1921, the chapel of Saints Peter and Paul. An ossuary beside it to hold the bones of the men who could not be individually identified. A bell tower added in 1928. A road from Bitola to the summit opened the same year, so that people could reach the chapel without making the same climb the Drina Division had made in September 1916. The skulls are there today, in the small church on the peak of Prophet Elijah at 2,521 meters above sea level, on the border between North Macedonia and Greece. The bones of men who died in September 1916 are stored in an ossuary beside a chapel that their surviving comrades built for them 100 years ago. It is considered a cultural site. Tourists visit it. They photograph the view. And the view is extraordinary. The lakes of Greece visible to the south, the entire Mariovo region of Macedonia visible to the north, the ground that the men in the ossuary died to hold. I find the chapel extraordinary not for what it is, but for what it represents about how the men on Kajmakchalan chose to memorialize what had happened there. They built it themselves, immediately after the battle, before anyone in Belgrade had organized a formal memorial commission or decided what the proper architectural language of Serbian military memory should be. They built a church because Serbia is an Orthodox country, and building a church was the specific way that Orthodox communities had always memorialized their dead. They put the bones of the unidentified in an ossuary beside it, because the bones had to go somewhere, and because the ossuary is the specific Orthodox form for communal burial of the unidentified. They did what made sense to them in the way that made sense to their specific cultural tradition on the mountain where the men had died. In 1921, when the war was still recent enough that many of the men doing the building had been on the mountain themselves. The result is a monument that is more honest than most monuments to the First World War, because it does not claim more than it knows. It does not put names on the bones, because it doesn't know the names. It puts the bones in a chapel and tends them. That is all. That honesty is, in its way, the most accurate account of what the Battle of Kajmakchalan was that any physical structure has managed to produce. The name of the mountain means cream skimmer, after a bandit who hid gold on the summit and was killed by his own men to keep the secret. The Serbs renamed it the Gate of Freedom, because it was the first piece of their country they took back. Both names have stayed. The mountain holds both meanings simultaneously, the way that specific places sometimes hold the weight of what happened on them long after the people who made that weight are gone. The official Serbian casualty figures for the Battle of Kajmakchalan, 4,643 total, 3/4 belonging to the Drina Division, 51 officers killed, 126 wounded, 1,876 soldiers dead, 5,941 wounded. Broader estimates, including the subsequent fighting around the Kruna Bend, place the total Serbian losses in the Monastir offensive at approximately 28,000. And that brings today's video to an end. Thank you so much for watching, and especially if you've made it this far. If you enjoyed this documentary, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow and allows me to continue creating these videos, so I hope you'll join me again for the next one. Until then, thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.